London, 1812, where the ton gathered beneath chandeliers to witness scandal disguised as dance, and where a single unlocked coffer could spill secrets more precious and perilous than diamonds. It was Lady Halberton's winter masquerade, that glittering annual affair where every debutante wore a mask of innocence, and every gentleman pretended not to be hunting dowries. The ballroom of Halberton House shimmered with candlelight and ambition, and the scent of roses and rivalry perfumed the air. But while the ladies paraded their feathers and the gentlemen their fortunes, one small, unassuming object was about to change everything. The coffer in question sat atop a side table in the withdrawing room, a mahogany box no larger than a sewing chest, inlaid with mother of pearl and crowned with a peculiar brass lock that had not seen a key in years. It had been dismissed by the ton as mere ornamentation until, dearest listeners, someone opened it. But before we delve into unlocked pasts and the reckless opening of fate's lid, permit me to introduce our heroine, Miss Violetta Langdale. She was not, as some would whisper, a governess. Nor was she a cousin twice removed from any duke, baron, or bishop. In truth, she was a companion to the aged Lady Trullan, widow to a Cornish admiral, and a woman whose health was as questionable as her memory. Violetta, at 21, was possessed of a beauty she did not trust and a past she never spoke of. She was clever, but quietly so, her wit tucked into hems and hidden behind teacups. As for our hero, sharp-eyed readers, you shall be pleased he arrived precisely at the moment the coffer opened. Mr. Quentin Zebley, heir to a tidy estate in Sussex and nephew to the Earl of Brancaster, strode into Halberton House with the air of a man who had never once considered being refused. He was tall, dark-haired, with a brow just serious enough to imply poetry, and a mouth that hinted he'd kissed more than one lady in moonlight, though never, assuredly, without permission. The ton adored him, though their daughters' reputations often did not survive his attentions. But that night, when Quentin passed through the withdrawing room in search of punch, or perhaps escape from Miss Dorothea, Churnley's eager fan, he found something altogether unexpected. The coffer was open, and standing before it, eyes wide and hands trembling, was Violetta Langdale. "My apologies," she said hastily, snapping the lid shut. But not before Quentin saw the contents. A sheaf of yellowed letters, a miniature portrait, and most curious of all, a child's ribbon, blue and frayed at the edge. "Curiosity," he said with a raised brow, "is a dangerous affliction in London." Violetta straightened, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. "So is arrogance. Yet I see no one administering cures." Touché. Dearest listeners, this author nearly dropped her quill in delight. Quentin stepped closer, his gaze flickering to the coffer. "That box has been unopened for at least 20 years. Or so Lady Halberton claims." "Then it is high time someone opened it," Violetta replied, eyes sharp. "Though I assure you, I did not mean to." "Accidental lockpicking?" he asked, amused. "A rare accomplishment." She let out a breath between amusement and exasperation. "The latch was loose. I thought it a place to set my fan. It clicked open. I had no intention of discovering a secret." She paused. Some secrets begged to be discovered. He studied her, as though trying to read a language he knew he once knew. "And some pasts are better left buried." Violetta's face shuddered. "Yes, but the past rarely cooperates." And with that cryptic remark, she turned and left the room, taking, this author notes with interest, none of the items from the coffer. But Quentin Zebley, who had never before found himself intrigued by a woman's exit more than her entrance, remained rooted to the spot. Of course, by the time the clock struck 11, the ton was abuzz. "It was her, I tell you," whispered Lady Eglantine Bloom, her ostrich feathers quivering with indignation. "That Langdale girl. She was seen alone with Mr. Zebley in the withdrawing room. Unchaperoned." A matron gasped, clutching her pearls as if they might leap from her neck. "Worse," Lady Bloom hissed. They were speaking. Intimately. Ah, dearest readers, nothing fans the flames of gossip like a conversation between a gentleman and a lady not yet affianced. And nothing terrifies a matchmaking mother more than a gentleman who ignores her daughter in favor of a penniless companion. The next morning, Quentin called upon Lady Trullan, under the guise, of course, of delivering a misplaced glove. Lady Trullan, who had not misplaced anything since the siege of Toulon, blinked at him through her lorgnette. You must mean Miss Langdale's glove. I haven't worn gloves since the pneumonia, young man. Quentin bowed. Indeed, ma'am. A lady's glove. Such items must be returned. Violetta appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. He handed her the delicate pearl gray glove and said, with practiced casualness, I was overcome with concern. I feared the glove might be lonely without its twin. Gloves, she replied, are accustomed to separation. They are, after all, always used one at a time. Not when worn, he said, by those with grace enough to dance. And there it was, the invitation, veiled as wit. But Violetta's eyes narrowed. I do not dance, Mr. Zebley. Then you must be the only lady in London who does not. Another reason, she said coolly, to remain unremarkable. But oh, dear listeners, Violetta Langdale was anything but unremarkable. And as Quentin left the Trulin townhouse, glove returned and curiosity thrumming, he made a silent vow. He would discover the truth behind the coffer's contents. And the girl who had opened it. By week's end, the Ton had turned against Miss Langdale with the speed of a foxhound scenting scandal. She had been glimpsed once speaking to Quentin Zebley in a garden alcove at Lady Whitseley's musicale. Never mind that he'd cornered her there, quoting Byron in a whisper that made even married women sigh. But society, dearest readers, is not interested in poetry. It is interested in impropriety. She is not of our world, Lady Bloom declared, smacking her fan shut. Some say she was born in France. Others worse believe she worked in a milliner's shop. Unmarriageable, one dowager pronounced. Unmarriageable? Oh, how this author adores a challenge. For that very night, as the strings began the first notes of a waltz at the Duke of Wortham's grand assembly, a gentleman crossed the floor with purpose, and offered his hand to a lady without fortune, title, or place. I find myself in need of a partner, Quentin said, bowing low. And you, Miss Langdale, are quite the mystery. A mystery, she said, placing her gloved hand in his, is rarely a wise pursuit. Perhaps not, he murmured as he led her into the dance. But I've never been wise. And as they turned beneath the chandeliers, the entire ballroom watching, one daring, whispered question passed between them. Did you read the letters from the coffer? No, she whispered. But I recognize the ribbon. Ladies and gentlemen, the past has stirred. And it is dancing. Dearest listeners, if one must fall from grace, let it be at a Wortham waltz, for at least the chandeliers are flattering and the musicians too well bred to pause mid-scandal. And fall Miss Violetta Langdale did, or rather, she was pushed, ever so gently, by the invisible hand of society's suspicion, which, as we all know, wears lace gloves and carries a lorgnette sharpened to a needle's edge. Mr. Quentin Zebley, meanwhile, was not a man accustomed to being doubted. Yet he now found himself plagued by questions, none of which involved estates or breeding mares, and all of which had the curious fragrance of lilac and ink. Violetta had known the ribbon had said so, while dancing a waltz with such poise that even Lady Crowthorne, high inquisitor of heel placement, had nothing to scold. The letters remained unread, tucked back into the coffer like secrets resealed, but the ribbon, frayed and blue, had whispered something only Violetta understood. And Quentin, for all his worldly confidence, had no notion what that something was. The next opportunity to investigate the affair, not the box, presented itself 2 days later at the botanical breakfast hosted by Mrs. Enderley, a widow of modest means and immodest orchids. The affair was held in her conservatory, where it was fashionable to admire ferns while pretending not to spy on those admiring each other. You do not appear to be contemplating begonias, Violetta said without turning, her gaze fixed on the glass ceiling where a cloud passed like a thought unspoken. I prefer to contemplate puzzles, Quentin replied, stepping beside her. And you, Miss Langdale, are the most compelling I have encountered. Then you must be easily entertained. On the contrary, he said, brushing a speck of pollen from his coat sleeve, I am notoriously difficult to amuse. Yet here I am. She turned to face him fully. Perhaps you ought to direct your amusements elsewhere. Lady Whitseley's niece appears to be cultivating an entire hothouse for your benefit. She lacks thorns, he said lightly. I prefer my flowers with defenses. I am not a flower. Agreed. You are something else entirely. Violetta looked away. I know what you are doing. You think if you flatter me enough, I'll tell you what you wish to know. But I remember what happens to girls who trust charming men. Then you misjudge me, he said, more quietly. I am rarely charming on purpose. A pause stretched between them, filled only by the rustling of palm fronds and the faint, conspiratorial laughter of Mrs. Inderlea's pug, who was being fed strawberries by a baronet's daughter with more curls than sense. What happened to the child? Quentin asked, keeping his voice low. The one who wore the ribbon. Violetta did not answer at first. Then, with a composure that cost her, she said, he died. In Devon. Fever. Quentin's posture shifted, just enough to betray that he had not expected grief to wear such plain clothes. Was he your brother? He was my son. Now, dear reader, mark the silence that follows a truth too large for a ballroom. Quentin, who had once faced down a charging bullock in Hampshire with no more than a walking stick and a poorly timed pun, said nothing. His name was Jamie, Violetta continued. I was 17. His father had already vanished, along with the name he gave me. My aunt took me in reluctantly. Jamie was not welcome. I left him with a vicar's wife in Tiverton while I found work. You were alone, Quentin said, not as a question. I was 16 when I arrived in London. I lied about my name and my age. I became a maid, then a companion, and I never saw Jamie again after the winter he fell ill. He was 5. Quentin looked as though he would have preferred a battlefield to the expression on her face. Why tell me this? Because you asked, she said. And because when you do ask, you listen. He took a breath, ran a hand through hair that had once driven half the ton to distraction, and said, if I could change the past for you, I would. You cannot, Violetta said. But you can leave it alone. I cannot do that either. Before she could reply, Lady Bloom's voice rang out from the other end of the conservatory like the shriek of a kettle left too long on the hob. Mr. Zebley, I've found a sprig of love lies bleeding. How apt. Quentin bowed, then turned to Violetta. If you ever wish to read the letters together, I shall bring the tea. That would be dangerous, she said. Then I shall bring cake as well. He stepped away, leaving Violetta with the orchids and her secrets, both of which were now in full and dangerous bloom. That evening, Lady Trulin, whose mind may have wandered, but whose instincts remained sharp, said, that Mr. Zebley has been calling more often. I do hope you're not developing a fondness for him. Violetta, arranging a vase of violets, replied, he is a man accustomed to getting what he wants. Then let us hope he wants something worth having. The next morning, a sealed envelope arrived for Violetta and signed, but unmistakably written in a bold, masculine hand. Inside was a single sentence. I have read the first letter. It mentions a girl named Violet and a promise broken. Violetta's hand trembled, just once, before she folded the page and tucked it into the pocket of her muslin gown. The Coffer had begun to speak, and Quentin Zebley, reckless heir and accidental confidant, had chosen not to walk away. Oh, my dearest readers, do keep your fans close and your ears closer. Secrets, once stirred, have a way of dancing. If there is one thing more perilous than a secret, dearest readers, it is a gentleman in possession of one and a reason to indulge it. Mr. Quentin Zebley, once the darling of drawing rooms and the despair of dowagers, had transformed overnight into something far more dangerous, a man with purpose. And that purpose, as this author observed with no small amount of glee, came wrapped in lilac ribbon and walked with the graceful caution of a woman who had learned to navigate society's ballroom without ever being invited to lead the dance. 3 days following the letter's arrival, Lady Hartington's charity auction brought together the best and worst of the ton, all of whom claimed to be there to support war widows, but in truth came to offer coin for scandal. The auction, as was customary, included not only objets d'art and baskets of preserves, but also the dubious delight of an afternoon's company with select eligible ladies. A practice which, one might add, continues to blur the line between bidding and bartering. Violetta, unsurprisingly, was not among the auctioned. Companions were not commodities. However, Lady Trulin had volunteered one of Violetta's watercolors for the cause, a modest landscape of Devonshire cliffs, painted with a steady hand and, as it turned out, a most inconvenient familiarity. Quentin stood before the painting longer than was strictly acceptable. You've been there. Violetta, who had thought him engaged in conversation with Lady Rosamund Edgeware's poodle, another creature bred for society, but built for silence, turned without flinching. I painted it from memory. Then your memory is precise. Those cliffs are no more than half an hour from Tiverton. I rode past them once, 5 years ago. Perhaps we passed each other, she said, her voice even. I would have remembered. A pause stretched between them, full of unspoken things. This author, seated conveniently behind a ficus with a view of both parties, noted a tightness in Violetta's posture that had not been present at the botanical breakfast. You've read more of the letters, she said. He nodded once. The second speaks of a promise made outside St. Luke's Chapel. A man swore to return by spring. He never did. She said nothing, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides. There are 7 letters, he continued. Only 2 signed with a name. William D. Weston. Violetta's eyes narrowed, though not in surprise. He was not a gentleman. He borrowed the name from a book. Then he fooled more than just you. He fooled himself. That was the greater crime. Quentin studied her with the quiet intensity of a man who had lived too long in rooms where nothing was said plainly. Do you wish to keep the letters? I will return them. No, she said. They are not mine to keep. They belong to the girl I was. And she is no longer welcome. Before he could reply, a gavel struck the dais and Lady Hartington called out. Next, we have a delightful Devonshire seascape, painted by Miss Violetta Langdale herself. Bidding begins at 5 guineas. There was a murmur. 5 guineas was generous for a companion's brushwork. 6 followed. Then 7. Then 50. Quentin said, without raising his voice. Gasps flitted through the crowd like startled pigeons. 50 guineas for a painting not even signed with a surname? Lady Hartington hesitated. Do I hear? No, Quentin said. You do not. And just like that, the painting was his. Violetta, to her credit, did not curtsy. But her gaze did not waver when he turned to her and said, Now I have a piece of you you cannot take back. Later that afternoon, under the pretext of retrieving a parasol Lady Trulin had forgotten, and which, this author suspects, was never brought to begin with, Violetta stepped into the Worthing House library, where Quentin waited with the coffer spread open once more. Only 5 letters remained, but the third, unfolded on the desk between them, was different. It was addressed to a child. My dearest Jamie, Violetta read aloud, her voice steady. You are too young to understand, and I am too much a coward to explain. But know this, if I vanish, it is not because I do not love you. It is because I love you enough to leave. She did not continue. She folded the letter and placed it back in the box. I wrote it, she said, when I first left him. I left it with the vicar's wife in case I died before returning. Quentin reached for her hand, but she stepped back. You cannot fix this. You cannot marry it into respectability or charm it into silence. It is not a stain to be covered. No, he said. It is a wound, and I am not here to soothe it. I am here to honor it. She looked at him then, truly looked, and something in her hardened expression began to soften not with surrender, but with recognition. You asked me once why I told you, she said. The truth, I mean. Yes. Because when you looked at me, it was not as a rescuer, or a judge. It was as a witness. He stepped forward. Then let me be the one who stays. Outside, the bells of St. Bartholomew's tolled the hour. Inside, silence hung between 2 people who had nothing left to hide. And dearest readers, what is love if not the freedom to be seen, fully, and still be chosen? Mark it well. The coffer has opened not only a past, but a future. The letters remain unread by the world, but no longer unread by each other. And though the tongue will cluck and whisper, as it always does, they will soon have no choice but to welcome a new union, one not of convenience or calculation, but of courage. The dance is not over, but the music, at last, is changing. It is a truth universally acknowledged though seldom admitted aloud that once a gentleman has declared his admiration for a lady with a scandal tucked neatly into her past, society will sharpen its claws and prepare for a feast. And what a sumptuous feast Miss Violetta Langdale had unwittingly laid before them. Lady Dorothea Churnley, whose only talent beyond embroidery was spreading calamity with the efficiency of a footman dispatched with a sealed note, had taken it upon herself to warn the other debutantes at Lady Swithenby's card party that Mr. Quentin Zebley had become ensnared, a word that, for a woman who had once mistaken a ficus for a duchess, was surprisingly apt. She has bewitched him, Dorothea declared, all but brandishing her fan like a dueling pistol. He bids on her paintings. He lingers in corners. He has taken to reading letters. The horror, dear readers. But while Dorothea plotted his rescue, Quentin was, rather inconveniently, enjoying himself at Trullan House on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, where Lady Trullan had insisted he remain for tea, due to the barometric pressure being unfit for gentlemen of breeding. One can only admire the ingenuity of a woman who used weather as chaperonage. "You're not afraid of them, are you?" Violetta asked as the wind pressed against the windows with all the subtlety of a gossip hungry for keyholes. Quentin leaned back in the rosewood chair, balancing a teacup with far more grace than any gentleman ought. "If you mean the ton, I find them about as threatening as a peacock in a thunderstorm, noisy, overdressed, and entirely useless in a crisis. They can still ruin us." "You speak as though we are a we." She looked at him, brows drawn. "Are we not? I should like us to be," he said. "But I am painfully aware that your opinion of me is still forming." She tilted her head, considering. "You are persistent. True. And reckless. Undeniably. And you carry yourself like a man who expects never to be refused. Only when I request jam." She smiled, but only slightly. "Then allow me to refuse you something else. I await your terms. You must not propose to me. That, dearest listeners, is what we call a conversational grand jeté. I beg your pardon." "You will be tempted," she said, setting down her cup with the precision of a woman about to detonate something. "Because you are kind, and because you think it will solve things. But I do not wish to be your act of redemption." Quentin stood. Not because he was offended, he was far too intrigued for that, but because standing allowed him to pace, and pacing, as any seasoned rake will tell you, is the surest way to collect one's thoughts without tripping over them. "You think I see you as a cause? I think you see a tragedy, and you want to rewrite the ending." He stopped. "That would require knowing what the ending was." She rose as well, chin lifted. "You already know enough." He stepped forward. "I know the girl who wrote those letters lived in fear. I know the woman standing before me survives by keeping everyone else out. And I know that when you say you don't want to be saved, what you mean is that you no longer believe it's possible." There was a long silence. Outside, the rain began to ease, though the sky remained sulky. "I have nothing to offer you," she said finally. "No name, no fortune, no family. I am not a lady." "No," he said. "You're something rarer. You are a woman who knows what it costs to be honest." She did not step back when he reached for her hand. "I don't want to fix you, Violetta. I want to choose you. Every day, with the truth and all its sharp edges." Her hand remained in his. From the corridor came a sudden clatter. Lady Trullan's maid had dropped a tray of teacups, presumably from the shock of witnessing a moment so intimate it might as well have been written in sonnets. This author, of course, would never drop a quill, no matter how swoon-worthy the declaration. Later that week, an invitation arrived in a thick ivory envelope lined with green silk. The Marchioness of Dinsbury's spring fête, a garden party of such grandeur that even the roses whispered their guest lists. Violetta had not expected to be included, but Lady Trullan, in a rare moment of lucidity and cunning, had sent her name along with her own. "Every woman over 60 is allowed one scandal," the old widow informed her. "I intend mine to be fashionable." And so it was that Violetta appeared on the Dinsbury lawn in a dress of pale celadone, modest in cut, but devastating in effect. The ton, who had expected her to arrive in mourning weeds or not at all, found themselves momentarily speechless, a most delicious rarity. Quentin, upon seeing her from across the lawn, did not rush to her. He waited until her eyes found his. Then, slowly and without ceremony, he crossed the grass and offered his arm. "A garden party," he said. "How dreadfully wholesome of us." "Don't be fooled," she replied. "The hedges are full of spies." They walked together past the croquet and the lemonade, past the string quartet and the gossiping matrons, and came to a stop beneath the flowering pergola. "I've spoken to my uncle," Quentin said. "He's displeased." "Because of me?" "No. Because I interrupted his fishing to tell him I'm marrying a woman with no title. He dislikes fish being disturbed." Her breath caught, but she did not step away. "I know you asked me not to," he said, "but the request has expired." "Has it?" He took both her hands in his. "Yes, because I am not offering charity. I am offering a life, and I will not live it without you." The pergola went very quiet. Even the bees, it seems, know when to hush. Violetta, who had once stood before a vicar's wife with a child in her arms and no name to sign, answered not with words, but with a nod that made something inside Quentin settle, as if a clock had found its rhythm. And then, wonder of wonders, Lady Bloom fainted, though whether from heat or sheer indignation remains unclear. By the time the orchestra began the next set, word had spread like fire through lace. Mr. Zebley had proposed to the Langdale girl. In public, with no hesitation and no retraction. Scandal had never looked so much like devotion. And as they danced, Violetta's left hand resting lightly on his shoulder, this author found herself for once at a loss for wit. For when a man chooses a woman not in spite of her story, but because of it, even the ton must concede. The treasure was never in the coffer. It was in the courage to open it.